They say love can heal. But sometimes love breaks you first. My name doesn't matter, I'm just the one who saw it all. I watched Helen's story unfold, from laughter to tears, from promise to pain. And if I've learned anything, it's that love, when poisoned, can turn even angels into prisoners. This is not a story of romance. It's a story of survival. A story of a woman who learned that the same hands that hold you tight can also be the ones that push you to the ground. So listen carefully, for in every beating there was a message. And in every scar a lesson. Helen wasn't supposed to be born. At least that's what her mother told me one afternoon, laughing softly as she folded laundry. She came when we were done having children, she said, but somehow she came anyway. And that was Helen, the unplanned child who became everyone's favorite. Her brothers spoiled her, her father called her my golden one, and her mother never raised her voice. She had that kind of smile that could make you forget your worries, the kind that made you believe the world was kind. But kindness is a fragile thing. Especially when the world you live in doesn't know how to handle gentle hearts. By 24, Helen had finished school and started working at a small hospital. She was the nurse everyone loved, the one who listened when no one else had time. But her real story started one evening under bright lights and loud music. It was the wedding of her cousin, Remy. The kind of wedding that Lagos never forgets, colourful, loud and full of drama. And that's where she met him. Michael. Tall, handsome, charming, the kind of man who knew exactly how to steal the room's attention. But when he looked at Helen, he didn't just see her beauty, he saw innocence. And innocence has always been a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. I was there that day. Helen was helping Remy fix her veil, laughing about how love looked good on her. And then Michael walked in, one of the groomsmen. Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air. He walked up to her with that easy confidence, said something that made her laugh, and from that moment he never left her side. He carried her bags, offered her drinks, and told her stories about his job in the city, stories that sounded too good to be true. But when you're in love, you don't check for cracks, you just admire the shine. That night, as the music played, I saw them dancing under the fairy lights. Her head on his chest, his hand around her waist, like two people who had known each other for years. Joshua, Helen's childhood friend, leaned toward me and whispered, "Mark my words, that man will bring her tears." I laughed then. But later I wished I hadn't. After that wedding, they were inseparable. If you saw Helen, you saw Michael. He would pick her up from work, drop her home, take her to dinners and send her flowers at the hospital. Everyone envied her, even her brothers said, "You found a good man." But I noticed something early. He never liked her talking to other men. He'd get quiet, his eyes would darken. Once when she laughed too long with Joshua, Michael held her wrist too tight. It wasn't anger yet, not violence, but control always starts with small things. Helen thought it was love. We all did. Because love, when it starts, always feels like a blessing. Until it begins to demand silence. The first real sign came one Sunday after church. Michael showed up unannounced at Helen's house, frowning. "I called you," he said. "I was in service," she replied, smiling. "With who?" He didn't shout. He just asked, calm, too calm. But that calm had an edge. That day Helen told me on the phone, "He just worries too much, it's sweet." I wanted to warn her. But love makes smart people foolish. Michael knew how to apologize. He had mastered it like an art. Every time he crossed a line, a gift would follow, a new dress, a dinner reservation, a promise he'd be better. And Helen, with her big forgiving heart, believed him. But what she didn't know was that every gift came with a price. Her freedom, her laughter, her peace. By the time she noticed, it was too late. Love had already wrapped its chains around her wrists. 1 year after they met, Michael proposed. He did it in style, the kind of grand gesture that turns ordinary love into headlines. A candlelit restaurant in Victoria Island, roses everywhere, his friends cheering, her name written on a cake. He went down on one knee, smiling that perfect smile, and said, "Helen, make me the happiest man alive." The crowd clapped, the cameras flashed. And Helen, trembling, said yes. But I saw something most people missed. Joshua, her old friend, was sitting beside her. His face was calm, but his eyes, they were not celebrating. He leaned close to her and whispered, "Are you sure you're making the right decision?" Helen smiled, pretending not to understand. But later that night she told me. He said it like he knew something I didn't. I wanted to tell her to listen to him. But who listens to warnings when they're wearing a ring? It was the kind of wedding that made people whisper, "God, when?" Helen looked like a princess, her smile brighter than the gold on her gown. Michael couldn't take his eyes off her. He held her close, kissed her hand, and told everyone, "She's mine now." But there was something about the way he said it, not love, but ownership. Joshua was there too, quiet in a corner, watching. "I remember he said to me, 'She looks happy now, but that man's love feels like a storm waiting to happen.' And he was right. 6 months later, the storm came. It started with an argument, small, almost silly. Helen had forgotten to serve him dinner on time. He didn't shout, not at first. He just asked, "What else are you doing that's more important than me?" She laughed it off. But the next thing she remembered was the sound of a slap. Loud, sharp. Like the sound of her heart breaking. He apologized before the bruise even formed. He cried, he said, "It was a mistake, Helen, I swear it'll never happen again." She believed him. Because that's what love does, it convinces you that pain is just passion misunderstood. But love doesn't heal what it didn't break. The beatings got worse. It wasn't every day, but when they came like rain that never wanted to stop. One evening she showed up at the hospital, her own workplace, blood on her lip, a cut near her eye. Dr. Barco attended to her quietly. He didn't judge, he just sighed. And when he was done cleaning her wounds, he said something she never forgot. "If you don't leave now, the next time you come here, I may have to call the police, or the morgue." Helen stared at him in silence. Even Nurse Melody, her closest colleague, couldn't stop her tears. But still Helen went home. Because sometimes, the fear of starting over is greater than the fear of dying where you are. It was the neighbors who called her parents that night. They heard the screams, desperate, muffled, terrifying. By the time her brothers arrived, Helen was lying on the floor, barely conscious. Her father's voice shook the entire building. He didn't wait for explanations. He carried her out himself while her mother sobbed behind him. That was the last night Helen slept in that house. The next morning she filed for divorce. Michael didn't show up in court. He sent flowers instead. A note pinned to them said, "You'll come back, you always do." But he didn't know this time she was gone for good. Helen moved back to her parents' house. The house she left as a bride, she returned to as a broken woman. Her mother cried every morning. Her father didn't talk much, but you could see the anger burning quietly in his eyes. Her 3 brothers, strong men with heavy hands and heavier hearts, avoided talking about it. Because in their silence, something dangerous was growing. Helen tried to heal. She went for counseling, took walks, and prayed at dawn. But every time her phone rang and an unknown number appeared, she froze. Sometimes she'd whisper, "What if it's him again?" She didn't know it then, but destiny was already planning a different kind of answer. After the divorce, Michael became a shadow of himself. The same man who once bragged about his power and influence now sat alone in bars, nursing cheap whiskey and regret. His friends stopped calling, his colleagues avoided him. Even his own family didn't visit anymore. No one wanted to be seen with the man the newspapers called the wife-beater from Victoria Island. But fate wasn't done humiliating him yet. One evening, a colleague invited him to a birthday party. He almost said no, but pride wouldn't let him hide forever. So he went. And that decision changed everything. The party was loud, laughter, music, and champagne. Michael walked in, pretending confidence. He was halfway through his second drink when he saw 3 familiar faces at the far end of the hall. Helen's brothers. At first he thought it was coincidence. Then he saw their expressions, calm, cold, and focused entirely on him. He tried to leave, but the door seemed too far away. Femi, one of Helen's close friends, blocked his path and said, "Leaving so soon, brother-in-law?" The music was still playing when the first punch landed. No one screamed, no one stopped them. It was like everyone in the room had silently agreed that justice had finally clocked in. By the time it was over, Michael couldn't move. His face was swollen, his pride shattered. And someone, maybe Joshua, whispered, "This is what happens when the hand of a man meets the tears of a woman." The next morning his face was everywhere. On newspapers, blogs, and social media. The same charm that once made him desirable now made him infamous. "Corporate executive receives public beating, accused of domestic violence," the headlines read. And just like that, his career was gone. He couldn't go to work, couldn't show his face anywhere. He had become a walking lesson. Helen saw the news on her phone. She didn't smile, she didn't cry. She just whispered, "Maybe now he knows what pain feels like when you can't defend yourself." And she went back to work. Back to living. Back to breathing without fear. Months passed. Helen healed slowly, not all at once, but enough to stand tall again. Joshua visited one day and said softly, "You're glowing again, Helen." She smiled faintly and replied, "I'm learning to wash my hands, so maybe one day I can eat with kings." He didn't understand at first, but I did. She meant she was letting go, washing her hands of pain, guilt, and the past. And somewhere deep inside her she knew she had survived what many don't. Because sometimes love is what saves you. Sometimes it's what you have to escape from to finally find yourself. Helen began therapy at St. Matthew's Wellness Centre. Every Wednesday she sat across from Dr. Barco, the same man who once treated her bruises in silence. This time he didn't ask about the past. He asked, "Who are you becoming now?" And she didn't know how to answer. Because after months of surviving, she had forgotten what it meant to live. He smiled gently and said, "Healing isn't forgetting, Helen, it's remembering without fear." That night she wrote her first journal entry. "Today I didn't cry when I looked in the mirror." It was the smallest victory, but the beginning of many. Rumors spread that Michael had lost his job. Some said he moved out of Lagos. Others said he was drinking himself into oblivion. Joshua told Helen, but she didn't react. She had learned to stop feeding pain with attention. Still, on some nights, she'd wake up from dreams where she was back in that house, hearing his voice, feeling the tension. And then she'd remind herself, it's over. Sometimes freedom doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. And you only hear it when the world goes quiet. One hot afternoon, Nurse Melody came to visit her. They talked about random things until Melody sighed and said, "You know, the doctor still keeps your file. He said he'll only close it when you stop flinching at loud sounds." Helen laughed softly. "Then maybe he'll never close it." But later that night, as she prayed, she realized something: she wasn't afraid anymore. The memories still hurt, but the fear was gone. That was the night she finally slept with her windows open again. No nightmares, no flashbacks. Just peace. Months later, while attending a wedding at her local church, Helen stepped outside for air. That's when she saw him. Michael. He looked thinner, older, his arrogance replaced by shame. He was standing by a tree, holding his hat in both hands. When he saw her, he froze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, "Helen, I came to say I'm sorry." Her heart raced, but her eyes stayed calm. She simply replied, "I forgive you, Michael, but I will never forget." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. As he walked away, she realized something powerful: forgiveness didn't free him. It freed her. That evening, Helen visited her father's garden. She sat by the fountain, dipped her hands in the water and watched the ripples spread. Joshua joined her quietly and said, "You've changed, Helen." She smiled faintly. "No, Joshua, I've just washed my hands." He looked confused and she added, My mother once said, if a man washes his hands well, he might eat with kings. I'm just preparing my hands for better company. The wind rustled the trees, and for the first time in years, Helen laughed freely, fully, and without fear. Her laughter sounded like sunrise. And in that moment, even the scars on her soul seemed to fade. Michael's life became a quiet ruin. After the beating at the party, no one trusted him again. He lost his position at work, his friends avoided him. And even his landlord refused to renew his rent. He moved into a small, leaking apartment in Yarba. Most nights he sat by the window staring into darkness, haunted by his own reflection. He tried calling Helen once, the number no longer existed. In the silence that followed, he whispered, "I should have treated her like a queen." But it was too late. When love turns into a weapon, the same hands that once held it end up bleeding from its edge. Helen enrolled in a women's empowerment course, one that focused on business, healing, and storytelling. She was quiet at first, still unsure of her voice. But one day, during a group discussion, she stood up and said, "I used to think silence was strength, but I learned that silence feeds pain. Now I speak for the girl I was and the women still afraid to speak." The room went still. And in that moment, something powerful shifted. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor with a message. Months later, Helen was invited to share her story on a local radio show hosted by Remy. Her voice trembled at first, but then it steadied. She spoke about love, control, and courage, without naming Michael. Listeners called in, sharing their own pain, their own escape stories. By the time the show ended, the host said, "You've given hope to women who forgot they could walk away." That night, Helen cried not from sadness, but from release. Her scars had become stories, and her stories had become strength. Meanwhile, Michael's drinking worsened. He often talked to himself, replaying moments from the past, the laughter, the wedding, the applause. One evening, he collapsed on the roadside. A passerby recognized him and muttered, "Ah, isn't that the man who used to beat his wife?" No one helped him up. He lay there, realizing that reputation is a shadow. Once torn, it never forms again. The next morning, he packed his few belongings and left Lagos. No one knew where he went. And no one asked. A year later, Helen's organization hosted an event, Voices of Strength. She stood before a crowd of women, government officials, and community leaders. Her parents were there, so were her brothers, smiling with pride. When she finished speaking, the hall erupted in applause. Her father whispered, "I thank God for giving you strength again." Tears welled in Helen's eyes as she looked around the hall. Not just at the people, but at the journey that brought her there. And for the first time she felt it deeply, the beatings were over. But the rhythm of her strength was just beginning. It was a cool Sunday evening when Helen went to the park near her new office. She loved to sit by the fountain and write. That day a frail man sat 2 benches away, coughing, trembling, dressed in worn clothes. She barely noticed him until he called out softly, "Excuse me, do you have water?" She handed him her bottle without looking up. When their eyes finally met, her world froze. It was Michael. He looked nothing like the man she once married. His face was gaunt, his hair scattered, his eyes hollow. He recognized her too, but all he said was, "I didn't come to hurt you, I just wanted to say you were right to leave." Helen sat there, torn between 2 storms, anger and pity. This was the man who once broke her ribs. The same man who swore love, then turned it into fear. And yet, seeing him so broken, she didn't feel hatred. Only sadness. After a long silence, she said, "I don't owe you anything, Michael, but I wish you peace." He nodded slowly. "I never knew peace could look like this," he whispered. Then he stood, thanked her, and walked away, limping, fading into the crowd like a forgotten song. 2 weeks later, Helen received a small brown envelope at her office. No return address. Inside was a folded note. "Helen, thank you for forgiving me that day at the park. I am leaving this city. I just wanted you to know I joined a men's support group. Maybe it's late, but I'm learning. You deserved better. Michael." She read it 3 times. And for the first time, she smiled without bitterness. Because sometimes, even those who hurt us can change, but only after losing everything they once held sacred. 2 years later, at a public awareness event in Ibadan, Helen stood on stage, addressing a crowd. When the event ended, a man walked up to her slowly. He looked older, humbled but familiar. "Michael," she said softly. He nodded, eyes lowered. "I came to say thank you. Your story saved me and many others. I'm not the man I was." Helen studied him for a long moment. There was no anger, no fear, no bitterness left in her. Only peace. She extended her hand. "Then prove it," she said, smiling faintly. "Keep saving others." He took her hand gently, the same hand he once hurt, and bowed his head. The crowd didn't know their history, but destiny did. That night, Helen sat by her window thinking. The city lights shimmered like stars that had fallen to earth. She whispered. The beatings stopped, but the rhythm remained, a rhythm that now sings of strength. Her mother walked in quietly and said, "You've truly proved yourself, Helen." Helen smiled and replied, "Yes, Mama, I couldn't have done it without you and Dad." In the distance, faint music played, soft drums, like a heartbeat reborn. The kind that tells you the storm is gone, and dawn has come. 3 years after the storm, Helen's foundation had grown beyond her dreams. She now led nationwide seminars on women's empowerment and self-worth. Her story had become a movement, a voice for the voiceless. At one of the gatherings in Abuja, a journalist asked her, "What gave you the strength to forgive a man who nearly destroyed you?" Helen smiled gently. "Because forgiveness is the bridge between who I was and who I am. Without crossing it, I would still be trapped on the other side." The hall fell silent. And in that moment, even the cameras seemed to pause, capturing not a victim but a legend. Helen was later invited to a state event, a round table with government officials, religious leaders and advocates. She was the only woman among them. When it was her turn to speak, she began with an old proverb her mother used to say. "He who forgives ends the quarrel." Then she added, "But if a man stains his hands with another's tears, he will dine alone in silence." The hall erupted in applause. Even the governor rose to shake her hand. And as she sat back down, Helen realized she was now living the very proverb that shaped her life. Weeks later, Helen received a letter from Ibadan. It was from the rehabilitation center, where Michael volunteered. He had passed away after a brief illness. The director wrote, "He spent his final days teaching men that strength is not in the hand that strikes, but in the heart that restrains." Helen sat quietly, holding the letter. She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered, "Rest, Michael, you've washed your hands too, maybe now. Your spirit can dine in peace." Months later, her parents organized a small family feast. All her brothers were there, laughing, teasing, and proud. As the meal began, her father raised his glass and said, "To our daughter Helen, the woman who turned pain into purpose." Everyone cheered. Helen smiled and replied, "To family, the shield that stands when the world falls apart." The laughter, the warmth, the togetherness, it all felt like a reward from life itself. The house that once saw her return in tears now echoed with celebration. Late that night, Helen stepped outside under the moonlight. I watched her from the porch, thinking how far she'd come. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Everything I lost taught me something I couldn't buy. The pain was the price, the peace was the change." And as the wind brushed her face, I finally understood. Life isn't about escaping the storms, it's about learning to dance when they come. The story of Helen spread like a timeless proverb, from city to village, from woman to man, reminding everyone that love without respect is poison, and pain, when purified, becomes power. In the end, Helen learned that true strength isn't found in fists or fear, it's in walking away and still choosing peace. Michael lost everything he once used to control her, and through that loss he found his own lesson. The hand that strikes will one day tremble. And for Helen, the girl who once cried in silence, she became a voice for thousands. If love hurts more than it heals, it's not love, it's bondage.